It's Way Up with Angela Yee. I'm Angela Yee, and Lieutenant Governor Antonio Delgado is here from New York State.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And you are from not New York City,
right,
but Schenectady.
Upstate. Born and raised in Schenectady. Lived there all through high school. Family still in Schenectady. But now live in Dutchess County.
All right, so for people who aren't from this area, how far is that from, say, Manhattan?
It's about 2.5 hours to Dutchess County. And then another hour or so, hour and 15 minutes to get to Schenectady.
Okay.
So, about 3 hours total.
And you are working with Governor Kathy Hochul.
Yes.
And she has quite an interesting story of even becoming governor. It was just a crazy time, things that we couldn't have anticipated. And it's interesting for you being from upstate because I also have a house upstate. And I just remember during the election time seeing a whole lot of Lee Zeldin signs on people's front lawns, So for you, coming from where you're from and winning to be in Congress, even where you're from, that felt like an anomaly.
Yeah, it was definitely a interesting time. When I decided to run in 2017, I was actually working in the city. I was working at a law firm in Midtown, and then decided to move back upstate, where I and my wife were from. My wife's from Ulster County.
Hey, Lacey.
Yes, shout out to Lacey. And we decided to run because we felt it was important, and I say we because it was a family decision. We had 2 little boys. They didn't decide, but twins, and it was going to affect their lives too. We knew it was going to be important to go home to get involved in public service at that time. And when we got there, me being from Schenectady, Lacey being from Woodstock, we felt like we were returning home. But the district that I was running in, it was 90% white. Trump had won it in 2016 by 7 points. It was a very rural seat.
Because people think New York and they always think New York City. They don't think about New York State.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And but at the same time, I think what grounded us and what anchored us was the fact that it was home. And, being upstate wasn't unfamiliar, to me or to her. And so we just got busy connecting with people. My parents worked for General Electric in Schenectady for a very long time. So when I spoke about growing up in Schenectady, parents working for GE, we were able to really connect. But that being said, there were a lot of folks who thought a person of color couldn't win in the district, let alone upstate, because no person of color had ever went to Congress from upstate New York.
Ever. Not a Latino, not a Black person. Yeah.
No. And so, but at the time we felt if we can connect people in a real way, listen to them, engage with them, and lead with love, we could do it. And I think, especially because now we're talking about hip hop 50, me being a former hip hop artist, I can understand why some folks maybe thought, oh, well, how's that going to translate? Is it going to work in upstate? But the fact of the matter is I knew, and my wife knew, and our community knew, our friends knew that, being from home and being able to talk about being from home and being who we are and true to who we are was going to resonate. And ultimately, it did. So
we didn't even get to the hip hop artist part yet. You brought it up first. And that was something that was used against you, though, at that time from your opponents when you were running for Congress.
It was used against me. They pulled a lot of the old, lyrics out of context and, videos.
Because it was positive rap, just to put that in way. Yeah.
My mother wouldn't have it any other way. That's not how I was raised. I was raised in the church. So my whole commitment to the culture was how do I utilize this platform in a way that can help us speak truth to power and talk about racial inequities, talk about misogyny, even talk about things like climate change. I was rapping about that, back in 2005, 2006. So, when they started to try to figure out how to make me out to be something that I wasn't, it kind of rang hollow. It rang hollow. And not just to those who knew me, but even to the community. I think they saw right through it. They knew it was a charade, and they were offended by it. And it ultimately, I think, galvanized them.
Yeah.
Right. I think they said, wait a second, you're trying to play us, really. You're trying to make us feel one way about this guy when we know he's not that way. So just talk about it truthfully, And I think we were able to meet folks where they were And ultimately, I think that's what allowed us to have success.
Well, let's get into you and your background, because I do always want to encourage people who may have never thought to run for office that it is possible. Because like you said, 90% white, it was an area that Trump had won by 7 points previously. And so people might say that's never going to happen and just count it out. Because I think sometimes we're really scared of change and we can talk ourselves out of things and say, this isn't possible, right? And you've shown that it is possible. So when you were younger, we talked about the whole hip hop thing. You really did want to be a hip hop artist, right?
Absolutely.
And you spent a lot of time. So where did things go left? Because clearly it didn't work out. We're here, which is fine. But why do you think it didn't work for you at that time? Because some people will feel like positive messages in hip hop don't always, I guess, they're not always the most profitable
and I think
things for labels.
That's certainly a part of it. There's a lot of reasons. I think some of it have to do with the actual industry and what's been deemed profitable. But I can own my own mistakes too. I think let me first say that when I decided to go to LA, I graduated from Harvard Law. So that was a big right turn or left turn, however you want to phrase it, for my family. What are you doing? You have a law degree. You've been, getting good degrees and overseas and at Colgate. Why?
We paid all this money for you to go to school, for you to be a rapper.
But I always told my family, you guys raised me to follow my heart, to follow my passion, to be true to who I am. I believe in the culture. I love the culture. I see it. I actually wrote and studied a lot when I was in law school about the essence of the culture and where it came from and how it could lead to change. And so I wanted to try to put that into practice. That was my focus. That was my drive. The problem, I think, for me at the time was I wasn't thinking about the business side of it.
Okay.
I didn't have a real business plan. I had a vision, right? I had an idea, right? And I think at the time I thought that was enough, that it was enough to just be inspired by, what I felt inside of me. And I think it is important for our young people to follow their hearts and to be inspired and to be true to who they are. And you never know. But it's also important to do your homework.
And have a plan.
And to have a plan.
I say that with small businesses all the time. You can't just say, I want to start a business. Well, let's do some research on the area. Let's see what kind of funding is going to be needed to get this off the ground. What is it going to cost me to hire employees? Where am I going to find these employees?
Yes.
Is this a great area for us to open a business?
And I was humbled. I think I went into it believing that it would manifest on its own if I just became an artist. And but at the same time, I didn't give up either. 5 years I was out in LA, and I had some pretty odd end jobs. I was a parking lot attendant. I was file clerk. I was doing all types of random things just to give myself time to record and write and perform. And my parents were calling me, asking me to come back home. My mom was in tears half the time, saying, "What are you doing?"
You're like, you went to Harvard Law School, sir.
No, I mean,
that is. And you met your wife in law school, right?
I did.
Okay, so was she supportive of this dream at the time?
Well, it was funny because so Lacey and I are very similar in that we both are creative spirits. And after law school, she didn't practice law either. She went and became an incredible filmmaker.
Yes.
And she still is a filmmaker. You see the difference?
Right. Okay.
Right. So
well, women, you know how we do.
But
she
when
had a plan.
She had a plan, and she'll tell you if you ask her what went wrong with me. She'll tell you he didn't have a plan.
Yeah.
Right. So, but we actually fell in love in law school. Love at first sight for me, but it was one of those things where I was a 1L first year law student. She's a third year law student.
Okay.
Timing wasn't right, and we ended up going our separate ways. 8 years later, while I'm now in LA and she's back in New York City, we reconnect.
Okay.
And that's when, and while we were reconnecting, I'm now transitioning out of the music space, trying to get back into law now because the music thing didn't quite work out.
Okay.
It didn't work out because, like we've established, I didn't have a plan.
Yeah, dope lyrics about climate change wasn't
going to cut it, right? and I just started to realize that what I had hoped for, it didn't mean that everybody, was on the same page. And so I had to feel whether or not I was comfortable staying in this lane or try other things, be more creative, speak about certain things that maybe I didn't really want to talk about, just to sort of broaden the audience. And I just ultimately decided that wasn't the path I wanted to go down.
But I have to say that that experience probably helps you with what you do now, as far as connecting with people, being able to express yourself, being comfortable in front of people and having to speak. Because, then you transition, like you said, to come back to New York, and then you practice law. And what area of law did you work in? It was criminal justice reform. You worked pro bono.
Yes. So I ended up working at a big white shoe law firm, focusing on the litigation side, financial restructuring, bankruptcy law, and commercial contract law, complex commercial contract law. And then I did pro bono as part of that under criminal justice reform, particularly juvenile lifers. And making sure that as we deal with the cruel and unusual punishment of committing a child to life without parole, which had ultimately been overturned by the Supreme Court, how do we re-sentence these individuals and get them back on track? So that was a big part of the work that I did when I was in the legal field. I will say, to your point, though, about the lessons that I learned when I was practicing or when I was a hip-hop artist, and I always tell young people this, failing for me, as much as it hurt, it was hard for me to let go of that dream. It definitely built some fortitude in me, and it gave me a real strong sense of who I am, and what I want out of my life, and what I believe in, and what I'm prepared to overcome and deal with to get there. And every trial and tribulation that I've experienced since then, I've leaned on what it felt like to fail in that moment and dust myself off and get myself back up. And so there's a lesson in failing. There's a lesson in tripping and falling and taking that risk. Even if you don't, do everything the right way, don't be too hard on yourself. The real lesson is what you do in response to that moment and how you build yourself. And those long hours and days, practicing law, that was hard for me to make that transition. But I had priorities. I had a family. I wanted to make sure that they were good, we were secure, I could provide. And so I was able to lean on, just that discipline and that focus and things that I was able to cultivate when I was a hip-hop artist.
And for people listening, these videos are still available, right?
There's a couple out there, yes.
What was the name? Was it AD?
AD The Voice.
AD The Voice.
AD
All right,
The
so
Voice.
make sure for the 50th anniversary of hip-hop, maybe we can get some of those back up.
They're out there.
In rotation. All right, so now let's move to that, because working in the space of criminal justice reform, was that one of the reasons why you said, I actually want to run for Congress to help push through legislation, because you saw a lot of things, like you said, that were happening, juveniles getting life parole, all of that. Is that what made you feel inspired?
Yes, that's a big part of it. I think deeper than that would just be broadly growing inequality and the idea that folks all across this country, in New York in particular, were being left behind. And I looked at my own life. I grew up working class. I grew up cutting coupons, putting clothes on layaway. I grew up, in tough neighborhoods. My parents worked us up out of those neighborhoods over time. But I remember,
you remember it, yes.
I remember, when I was 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, the proximity and what was around, and my family, my cousins who've been in and out of jail. So it
feels normal, too, when you're growing up, because you grew up that way. So it's so normalized, like this is what life is like.
Right. And I was just talking to my brother about this, how when you really step back and think about that period in our lives, what was happening, who was in our lives, our parents, friends, and just really thinking through that dynamic, it was revealing to think about sort of where we started and then how they ultimately, worked really hard and got us, to safer neighborhoods, bigger apartments. And then by my freshman year in high school, we were able to move into the suburbs and buy a brand new home. And that was, remarkable for me. And I saw that. I saw how it happened.
Right.
And my dad, who raised me, my stepfather who raised me, who came into my life when I was 2, he pulled me onto that plot of land and said, this is what hard work, in this country can get you. So those kind of things, they kind of stuck with me. And so when I saw the energy shifting, I felt like there was more of a focus from our political leaders on being divisive, on, pitting folks against each other, spreading hate over love, and not really thinking about upward mobility for everybody, but concentration of wealth and power. I felt like I have been too blessed and too fortunate to not figure out how to utilize, my skills and what I've been able to do over the course of my life to get in the ring.
Did you feel a real shift when Trump became president?
I felt very concerned about who my children were going to be looking up to, and other children. I felt very concerned about the energy that was brought into the fold. It felt divisive. It felt dark to me, and it felt like it was important that we bring, to the extent that we can, some light into the situation. Because the fact of the matter is, Black and brown communities disproportionately feel the effects of that kind of energy. Everybody feels it. Everybody feels it. But because of our history, we're going to feel it disproportionately so. And so I felt very compelled to step in and figure out how to engage. And I can tell you, once I became a member of Congress and I was able to engage with a lot of poor white people in rural upstate New York, you can see the pain and you can understand the anxiety, and how if you're not there on the ground connecting with people, no matter what their background, if they feel left behind and unheard, they're going to be angry and they're going to be upset. And it's important to figure out how to bring change to those communities, to the communities that have been left behind and forgotten. Black, brown, white, doesn't matter. And I think that's where political leadership needs to go. I feel like we're not there. We've gotten stuck on sort of maintaining what is.
Yeah, and things are definitely divided amongst the party lines. And I want to talk about this, these 10 regional councils that you're spearheading. It is the state's Hate and Bias Prevention Unit.
Yes.
Okay, so we've never had something like this, have we?
Not statewide.
Okay.
No, there are hate responsive task force, where the city might have a task force that might be reacting to a situation that's been deemed a hate crime. But this is more preventative, where we have 10 regional councils all across the state, from the city up to the North Country, out to Western New York and Buffalo. And the idea is to have actors who are really engaged in the work of love, compassion, and advocacy and tolerance, whether it's educators, faith leaders, business leaders, who come together voluntarily to connect based on the needs of their community, to engage with the community in dialogue and to create events that foster more harmony and more unity and create opportunities for difficult conversations. Because oftentimes, the hate that people feel sometimes comes from ignorance. It's not because they just naturally feel that way. You just have to figure out how to help people see the truth and guide them. And I think being non-judgmental in the process is important. So as the chair of the Hate and Bias Prevention Units, which is now under the umbrella of the Division of Human Rights, I am leading the statewide effort to take on these preventative steps. Hopefully, to sort of create a different climate, a different energy. Yeah,
because I remember seeing the statistic that shootings and homicides were down, but hate crimes were up.
Yes. And I think that the fact that hate crimes are growing, that should really disturb everybody, because that means there's something going on in the psyche of us collectively, that we're separate from each other, that we're not connected. And that is a very dangerous space to be in. And when you look at the kinds of leaders that are emerging right now, you get more demagogues when you have that kind of environment. They can manipulate that. Oh, okay, we see people are on edge. They're anxious about stuff, and so they play with your feelings. They play with your emotions, and then they call themselves, leaders. And for me, that's what makes me the most frustrated and determined, to push back against, because I'm just tired of the hypocrisy and, the negativity, and not really fighting for people, right? People aren't doing that when they call themselves leaders. And so the Hate and Bias Prevention Unit is meant to get some real coalition building going on the ground, be very intentional about it on the ground.
So give me some examples of things that can be done, because I've been, all the time, I see different things happening. And I also saw the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams. Yes. He was saying a lot of times the hate crime charge gets dropped. Right? When people are charged with things. We saw the whole situation with O'Shea Sibley. He was stabbed, he was voguing in the gas station. And that was clearly but the fact that they even had to investigate it, we heard, the slurs and the things that they were saying. And then recently I saw there were these teenagers, they attacked an Asian family on the train. Right? I'm sure you obviously saw that video. But what was interesting to me was the family was like, look, these young girls, there's something that must have happened in their lives for them to be like that. This is not a hate crime. Even though there were certain things that were said, like go back to your country and things like that.
Right.
But it is true that these are young people and they're getting this from somewhere.
So I think there's two pieces to what you articulated there. And I think you can argue that they're, competing. There are young people who are breathing in the air, right, of this toxicity. And Nelson Mandela said it, no one's born to hate.
Right.
No one, comes into the world hating somebody because of the color of their skin, their race, their gender, sexual orientation. That is learned behavior. Love is a natural emotion. You feel that naturally. But there's nothing natural about hate. It is cultivated. It is designed over the course of human actions, rooted in a lust for power. And so ultimately, we have to be able to make sure our young children are being taught the power of love and engaging with them as early as possible and are being raised and reared in communities that are anchored in love. And we also have to hold bad actions to account, right? It's those two things are not mutually exclusive.
Right.
You have to, because otherwise, without the accountability piece, you ultimately undermine what you're trying to establish, because you want young people to appreciate that there are going to be consequences for your actions. And this is not appropriate behavior. This is behavior that is terribly harmful to the community and to yourself.
Right.
Right. And so we have to make sure that we prosecute and pursue justice in a way that is both that meets that apportions the punishment in a way that hopefully deters the action, but also creates a space where that young person in particular can learn and be rehabilitated, right? That there's a restorative aspect to the process. That has to be more included in how we think about punishment, right? It's restored. It should be a restorative process as well. And especially for our young people. I've been traveling across the state and engaging in communities and with communities. And one of the things that I hear from the leaders in those communities is our young people don't have any spaces to go into, to be themselves, to be free, to be silly, to be fun, to just be normal kids, and in the absence of those kinds of spaces, it's a hard environment.
So what are some proactive things that you think would be beneficial?
I think being more focused on youth enrichment centers, boys and girls clubs, after school and before school programming, summer enrichment programmings, making sure that we create physical spaces that are welcoming within our communities, empowering in a very intentional way the mentors, the educators, the coaches, the faith leaders in those communities, like real partnerships, not just throwing money at the area or the community and checking the box and saying this organization got it, so we're good, but figuring out who's actually doing the work on the ground, who are the individuals that are trusted in those communities, and making sure that they're properly supported and enhanced. A lot of times you hear folks say, well, they're doing a lot of good work, but, they don't really have the organizational capacity to really scale up. And that might be true. But then do we walk away from that problem? Or do we have a responsibility to some extent to figure out how to leverage what they have at the state level and grow it up?
Right.
And put the proper personnel in place. But that takes prioritization, right? You have to actually want to do that. And I think we're getting there. And I think we're pushing in that direction. It's certainly something that I and the governor talk about, is how do we get more direct and be more intentional? And when we think about equity and when we think about inclusivity, what are we doing to really create that environment in an intentional way?
How did you and the governor actually end up, you ran on the ticket with her. So how did that come about? How did you guys connect?
Well, that was, it kind of came out of thin air. It wasn't, it wasn't as if the governor and I had a long-standing, relationship. We actually connected when I was in Congress. I think a couple of times she came to D.C. to connect with the New York delegation. She came to my office. We had a good discussion. But this was a year at least before we had even had talks about me potentially becoming the lieutenant governor. When everything went down with the prior lieutenant governor, there was a bit of a situation where I think she was trying to figure out with her team, who could potentially be in this position. I, at the time, was was in Congress, gearing up to run for a third term potentially, trying to figure out, what that was going to look like, and thinking about my family and thinking about my boys turning 9 years old at the time, twins, and, the challenges of that lifestyle. And so while I was thinking about all that, this opportunity just kind of came to me. I was approached to say, hey, would you
So the
be
team
interested?
basically vetted you out, like, let's see who would be good. And
I
then
think there was obviously some work done, to figure out what I brought to the table. And when the opportunity came, I could just tell you where my head was at. My head was at, well, I love being in Congress. I love serving my district. And we've done a lot of good things, 18 bills signed into law, 10 under Trump, 8 under Biden, helping our farmers, our veterans, our small business owners, doing all that. So I was in the work, but I also really liked the idea of coming back home to New York and trying to figure out how to do the work statewide and get into every community across the state, and really engage with the diversity of the state.
Right.
That was compelling, and to do it and still be home, right? And I have to leave the state so I can wake up in my own home, with my family.
Go to work, yeah.
Go to work, right? As opposed to being in D.C. for 2-3 weeks at a time and then coming home and then getting on the road again. So all those pieces for me, and the opportunity, was something that, we felt very good about. And, once I got to talk with the governor and we had some good conversations about, what the future could look like, we went from there.
What would you say have been some of the biggest challenges in this first year for you?
I think everything comes with a learning curve, So, my old district was big. It had 11 counties. All right, so I thought that was big, bigger than Connecticut and Rhode Island combined. But, the state's a lot bigger than that. And, so just learning the state, getting around, trying to figure out all the nooks and crannies and all the different communities, and just figuring out how to relate to people in a real and authentic way.
What matters when you talk to people, because I've seen you all across the state. So what are some of the things that people are bringing up the most?
I think there's a lot of different elements, but if I had to sum it up, there's this sense that people want to know where we're going. We don't. And that can manifest in different ways. If you go to a community, for example, that doesn't have broadband,
right? Well,
that in and of itself is a problem, but it also signals to them, well, what are we doing here? How do we not have broadband? So, if you go to a community that has main streets where the small businesses are, shuttering, right?
Yeah.
What are we doing?
We've been having a crazy issue with that.
Where are we going? Right? And I think people want to understand what the vision is and how. What we're doing economically and educationally to empower our young people. I think families want to know that their children can stay in New York and thrive. And I think layered on top of that is this sense of
affordability is a really huge issue. I feel like
it's a massive
when it comes
issue.
to housing, congestion pricing. We're gearing up for that potentially next year. I'm concerned about that.
I think the affordability piece is real. And I think whether it's the housing, whether it's transportation, whether it's healthcare. You name it, consumer goods.
Because New York is such an expensive place for people to live. And then the other issue on top of that right now is with, all the, listen, I am all for making sure that we provide housing for migrants who are coming here, who are fleeing whatever situation they're fleeing, and making sure that they get processed and go through the system in the proper way, but also be treated with dignity as human beings. But how can we provide that? I think that's also a really huge issue, because you can see certain people are trying to make an example out of New York City. I feel like we're always the example. They want to show New York is known to be liberal, especially in New York City in particular. And I feel like a lot of times they do things to try to make us have a more difficult time, so they can be like, see, we told you these liberals are trying to make this happen, and now it's a disaster.
So I will tell you, I think I really appreciate where you started in terms of, first of all, recognizing this is a humanitarian crisis, that there are people who are fleeing circumstances, families, and we can never lose sight of that aspect. And I think what makes New York special is that we do have that capacity to lead from the heart and to love and to care for people in a real and genuine way. But we also need to have a plan, right? And we need to make sure that we are dealing with the practical realities of a situation. It goes back to in sort of in a smaller way, the hip hop conversation, right? I might have believed something. I might have thought I had
with all
a
great
lane,
intentions,
right? But ultimately, I need to make sure that I understand the practical realities of a situation. And I think when you have an environment too that is filled with toxicity, and you have demagogues and people who want to be divisive and anxiety, what happens is it even makes trying to create those practical solutions even more challenging.
Right.
Because everything you put out becomes exploited or manipulated or used for somebody else's advantage politically, as opposed to what is the problem we're solving for and how do we get it done, and speak honestly and truthfully to the public about it. And I think there's going to need to be real coordination. The governor has been talking an awful lot with the White House. Keep in mind, this is a problem that fundamentally goes back to our borders, not New York borders, right?
Right.
So ultimately, when it gets to immigration law, comprehensive immigration reform is imperative. We have to have that, and we don't, right? And so because of that, New York feels a lot of the fallout of those challenges, and it's incumbent upon us to be thoughtful around that dynamic, but then also to have proper coordination between the city and the state, and making sure that we're all on the same page about how we want to manage the situation without being so quick to point fingers and blame anybody.
Right. We end up gridlocked in a situation and stagnant. All right. Well, listen, I wish we could talk for like hours because I have so many other things that I want to discuss, from me being a lifelong resident. And so I do care so much about everything that happens here. That's why I want to encourage people who are listening to make sure you read straight from the horse's mouth all the time, because there's a lot of misinformation that gets spread when you look at social media and when you look at other people's recounting of what someone else said. And so that's why it's important for me to have you come up here and just say things straight from your mouth. But also I feel like for people to see someone that they can relate to as well.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you and the platform you have and the voice you have. And I just, really want to say thank you for having me and look forward to future conversations.
Yes, me too. Maybe you can do the theme song for the show or something. We get you back. Lieutenant Governor Antonio Delgado, how can people reach out to you if they want to express themselves, if they want to get involved, if there's anything happening they need to know more?
If you go to my website, if you search me, Lieutenant Governor of New York, it'll pop up. You can get to me on all my social handles, Twitter and Facebook, Instagram. It's pretty easy to do.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's Way Up with Angela Yee.